Welcome back to Embracing Tradition. Today I'd like to talk to you about the 5 types of people who are confronted by the early church fathers. The first type of person that is confronted by the early church fathers, I would call the ignorant. And this group or this category would encompass the overwhelming majority of Christians. Most Christians could not name an early church father. Maybe they could tell you Augustine. And then if you ask them, okay, name one more, maybe they'd have a hard time with naming a few. It's kind of like that professional football team fan, and then you ask them, okay, name 3 players, and they can't do it. This is the category of the ignorant. They hear maybe a quote at church in a sermon from their pastor. They hear things about the early church from others, but they've never taken the time to actually read the sources themselves. If I had to guess, I would say among all the Christians, this would encompass more than 90% of Christians on the planet today. They're just ignorant of what the church fathers taught, who they were, what they were about. And really, whenever I'm talking about the church fathers, I mean the early church in general. So the first category, definitely the largest, that would be the ignorant. The second category I'm going to call the lazy. These aren't really flattering. None of these maybe are going to be flattering. Maybe one of them. So the second category of people who are confronted by the early church fathers would be the lazy. These are people who want to win a debate online. So they want to know a little bit. They spend a little bit of time. Maybe they type into a Google search something like defend sola fide from the early church fathers. And then they just quote mine and read, somebody's blog post defending sola fide in the early church fathers. Or they will type in faith alone in a search on the early church fathers, and they will just try to find whenever they talked about faith or they used the word alone. It's really a dishonest approach to reading the early church fathers, but I find that a lot of people fall into this category. Recently, I was in a group with a group of young men, and one of the young men was trying to defend that St. Augustine firmly held to sola fide. Just absolutely ridiculous. These quotes, that he was giving, and basically all he was doing was showing that St. Augustine really emphasized the importance and the authority of the scriptures, which everyone agrees with. Catholics certainly affirm the authority of the scriptures. But what he was trying to do is anachronistically place the 16th century doctrine of sola fide, and he was trying to place it into the early church with St. Augustine and show these quotes where St. Augustine basically said the scriptures are great. And you can't do that. This would be a very lazy approach to reading the early church fathers. I'd like to also mention that sadly, I don't think all pastors, all Protestants, fall into these 2 categories. But sadly, many pastors even fall into this category. If you're an evangelical and your pastor quotes the early church fathers, there is a good probability that he falls into either the first or this second category. He's just ignorant and he's just reading a quote that he saw that he liked, or he's lazy and he's actually read a little bit more, he's dug a little bit deeper, but he's just doing it in a very lazy, unscholarly manner. And so that's the first and the second. The third category is the deceitful. The deceitful one. And this one, of all of the categories, this is the one that I'm most fearful of. And what I mean by that is I worry the most about their soul. These are ones who would read the early church fathers and twist and deceive what they're saying in order to fit what they believe. They would say things, ridiculous claims like the early church didn't believe XYZ, when it's very clear that virtually everyone in the early church believed these things. Doctrines such as the perpetual virginity of Mary, the true presence of Christ in the Eucharist. These are clearly undisputed doctrines that the entire early church believed. And there are those who will go to the early church trying to find their perspectives and then have the audacity to misrepresent them and act as if they didn't believe doctrines that they clearly believed as a whole. So this third category, I don't think this isn't a huge number of people, but I've seen this a lot, and this is the deceitful. One reason why I'm so fearful for this category is because most often when you're being deceptive like this, you're in a position of authority. A layperson isn't going to care enough to be deceitful with the early church fathers, usually. Usually it's a pastor or someone else with teaching authority that's going to be deceitful like this. And why are they doing this? Well, I can sympathize with them some because I was in a position of authority. I was in a teaching and a preaching position. And so having to defend what you believe, your livelihood is on the line. If I see that the early church clearly teaches something and I am not in agreement with it, it looks bad. And so I need to make myself look better. I need to defend what I believe. And there's this push to credit yourself as being authoritative and authentic. But when we twist and we manipulate things, we are on very shaky ground. This fourth category, I would say, is by far the smallest category. And I almost didn't add this one, but in order to be charitable, I think it needs to be added. It's a very, very small number of people. And so they wouldn't fit in the ignorant category. They wouldn't fit in the lazy category. They wouldn't really fit in the deceitful category either. And this is just a fourth category of those who are unconvinced. The unconvinced. These are people who do the work. They read the original sources, the primary sources, the material that from the early church, and they walk away unconvinced of the early church's position on certain things. Or they would believe that the church has developed to some degree, away from the early church being 2,000 years ago, and that they are still in agreement with it for the most part. And so this very small minority of evangelicals that are simply unconvinced that the early church leads to Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy. The interesting thing about this category is that without failure, these people who are unconvinced are the most charitable for the ancient faiths, such as Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. These Protestants are the ones who will very quickly defend that Catholics are actually Christians. These are ones that will not be mourning that you've left the church and you've gone off into apostasy. And why is that? Well, that's because they've read the early church and they know, some things that they believed, and they're much more apathetic towards our understanding of things. So this fourth is the unconvinced. And the fifth category would be the convinced. John Henry Newman said, "To be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant." And so the convinced go back to the early church, they read the church fathers, they read the history of the early church, and they are convinced that their religion, that their Christianity doesn't look anything like what it did in the first few centuries of the church. And they're convinced, so they convert. We're seeing a wave of young people who are going back to the original sources. They're reading the church fathers and they're saying, my praise band rock concert with disco light and fog machine doesn't look anything remotely close to the early church. Is this even Christianity anymore? It looks so different. And so they're going back to the ancient traditions like Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. And so I would encourage you, if you find yourself in one of these categories, I think I've dealt with all the categories. Maybe you would say, I'm in a different category. Well, let me know in the comments. I tried to be charitable with these categories. But if you find yourself in one of the top 3 categories, I would really challenge you. If you care about these things, all of these resources are readily available. There's really no excuse in 2025 for you not to read the early church fathers. I'd like to answer the question, why read the early church fathers? What reading the early church fathers does is it allows us to remove ourselves from the bias of the culture that we live in and place ourselves in a culture that is completely foreign to us. A culture that is much closer to the time of Jesus Christ himself when he was on this earth. We're able to hear from disciples of the disciples of Christ. And we're able to hear their perspective of what did Jesus actually mean whenever he said this? What did the Apostle Paul mean when he said this? Well, the Apostle Paul had disciples that he trained. And those men were able to teach us. And when we read the early church, we find what are the traditions that were passed on to them. Why do we find in the early church, in just the first few hundred years after Christ resurrects from the dead, why do we find people praying to saints and praying to Mary? How are these things happening? When we read the early church, we find out. C.S. Lewis famously said, if you must read only the new or only the old, I would advise you to read the old. When you read a modern commentary or a modern book from an author that's living today, you're probably reading somebody who got all of those ideas from the early church. They got all of those ideas from men that had passed on before them. Instead of reading them through their modern lens, why not go back to the original sources themselves and read them for yourself? Really, there is no excuse for you not to read the early church fathers in the year 2025. You can access all of their works online for free and read them. We will provide the links in the description of the video where you can find some of these resources. Don't be intimidated by the church fathers. Some of them write in a way that is not modern English, and so it can be more difficult to understand. But what I found is that most of them are fairly easy to understand. They're not writing in a way that a lot of the reformers and the Puritans did, with this lofty and high English and language that is foreign to us. A lot of the early church fathers write in a simple and clear manner. So you might be asking, where do I start? I would recommend with Against Heresies by St. Irenaeus. It's really sad that so many Christians would have no idea who he was. He was in the 2nd century, and this man was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of St. John, the apostle of Jesus Christ. And so you have a disciple of a disciple of a disciple, a grandchild of St. John, the apostle of Christ. How could we be Christians our whole lives and not read his works? So I would recommend to you start out with Against Heresies by St. Irenaeus, and we will leave a link for that work in the description below as well. Thank you so much for watching our videos. My wife and I greatly appreciate all of the support that we've received so far. May the Lord bless you this week.